welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. This is Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. And this is the third installment in our series 80s Indies. Today we'll be discussing 1982's Smithereens, directed by Susan Seidelman.
You know, I got in a fight on a bus once. Some jerk's giving me a hard time, lawyer type, reading the New York Times. And he kept inching his shoulder closer to mine, so I kept moving away. But all the time he's hiding behind his paper, like he's minding his own business. So you know what I did? I pretended like I was lighting a cigarette, and then I reached over and I lit his New York Times on fire. Boy, was he pissed. So was a bus driver. He kicked me off the bus. I had a good laugh at him. I didn't pay to get on the bus anyway.
You didn't really do that.
Yeah, I did. No big deal.
Smithereens is a 1982 American drama film directed by Susan Seidelman and starring Susan Berman, Brad Rinn, and punk rock icon Richard Hell. The film follows a narcissistic young woman from New Jersey who comes to New York City to join the punk subculture, only to find that being part of the scene is harder than she thought it would be.
Yeah. And again, it's that old New York like we saw with Miss 45, our first movie in the series. Mm-hmm. It's that, the New York of the 80s, which was a lot, like we talked about before, grittier and dirtier.
Very dirty.
Yeah, you can actually see the dirt like in some of the shots, a lot of the shots. So yeah, it's a very raw and street level film. And the first time I had seen it, you had seen it before though, correct?
Yeah, I saw this film a little while ago. Probably I want to say 5 or 6 years ago at this point. Been a little while. Which is now, cool. Throughout the series.
Was that with the director? Because I know you had spoken to the director.
No, so what Mark is referring to is I saw this right when I saw this movie. I was just kind of starting out making films on my own, and at the time I was doing a lot of real ragtag. I had just moved to New York City, and I was doing a lot of kind of ragtag. Wandering in the streets with friends and a camera. Kind of this kind of guerrilla filmmaking, and I was really inspired by what she was able to pull off. So I just reached out to her via social media. Just with a message and just, introduced myself and told her how much I enjoyed her film and described some of the challenges I was facing. And the response, she was really encouraging, and the response was really nice of her to get back to me at all. And one quote that I'd like to lead with, which I think it perfectly encapsulates this film, is she said, "The more I ran into obstacles, the more determined I became to finish it being the film, of course." Which I think for a series about 80s indies and for an 80s indie film, I think that's kind of encapsulates perfectly the entire ethos of what this style of filmmaking is all about.
Definitely. It must have been like the perfect movie for you to watch when you first moved to New
York. It was just so cool. Like especially I'd walk the streets, and I'd see the locations that maybe she shot some of it in, and I'd be like, I could use something like that, but it looks like a totally different thing now because it's now all these years later. So it is really cool. There is this lineage, I think, with New York filmmakers versus LA filmmakers, where I think New York filmmakers really kind of take a lot of pride in how scrappy they are. You see people all the time just out on the streets, just with no crew, just doing the most wild, bold, daring guerrilla thing, and it's really cool to be part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this was 1982. So the same year as the last film we talked about, Eating Raoul, although on the other side of the country. So that was took place in LA, and this takes place in New York, obviously. And this is, I would say, a very different vibe from the first two 80s indies that we've talked about so far. And this is more of, I would say, like a character study about this 20-something Ren is her name, making her way in 80s New York. And I found it very interesting because I personally, I don't know how you feel about them, but I love character studies. I think, for a low budget movie, doing that kind of a film makes a lot of sense, and it lets you be more loose. And also, if you know that as an audience member, that's what you're watching, I think you can, your expectations will be more in line with what's presented to you, right? Because if you're not expecting too much of a story or too much plot or anything like that, then you kind of just go along for the ride. So I like those kinds of movies where you kind of just strap in and go along with this character. And a lot of times the character is not, maybe not the funnest to be around, as I would say with this character, Ren, and like the movie The Comedy comes to mind. I don't know if you've seen that with Tim Heidecker. where you're following this awful person and his awful friends, and I find that. And Bad Lieutenant, we talked about Abel Ferrara. That's another movie that comes to mind. So these character studies to me are very interesting. Just following these people and seeing what their story is. And Ren's story is a very I would say unique one, but not too unique, right? I think a lot of people maybe found themselves in this category, or even today find themselves moving to a new city and trying to fit in with different cliques and different groups. So I think it's a very relatable story.
Yeah.
Not one that gets told a lot. So I thought that was interesting. And it's definitely very quirky, very raw movie. And it's also, it encapsulates the waning punk scene at the time. It kind of hit its peak, I guess, around this time, you could say.
Yeah.
Or I guess even a little bit before, the Sex Pistols, late 70s, early 80s. So this was, early 80s. And I guess she might have filmed it closer to 1980, probably a little bit earlier.
I would imagine for an indie like this,
Yeah,
if it came out in 1982, it was probably being shot, 1980, maybe even 79, possibly. I don't know for sure,
but either way, it's really one of those movies that's like a snapshot of a time period. And so the movie starts out with this character, Ren, just a young woman who we gather she's recently moved to New York, and she's walking around the streets, handing out flyers for a show. And it really just throws you into, I think Susan Seidelman does a great job just throwing you into that energy, that raw energy of the city, and also of the live show once we get into the small venue that she goes into. And the camera work is very kinetic in that opening. And Ren meets someone named Paul, who's a young man who's kind of in the same situation as her. And so Ren and Paul meet at the show, and they kind of keep running into each other after that. And eventually Paul takes her out. And I like that B-movie, that horror movie that they watch
I really enjoyed that as well.
It's such a a little nice little
I'm guessing
side thing.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's something that was made by them for the. I don't know.
I wonder if that was made for this, or if maybe one of her friends had made that, or if it was even a film that maybe.
Because it's a lot of fun. It's a really.
It reminds me of just like a crazy student film or something.
It feels like something else we would talk about on this podcast.
Definitely, for sure, yeah. So I love that. I thought that was great. And Paul's in a band. Ren is not a musician. She's not in any bands, although. I guess her whole thing, Jeremy, is that she wants to be part of the scene without actually really contributing anything. She doesn't really play an instrument or sing or anything like that. I guess you could say maybe publicity. She tries to drum up, publicity.
Kind of like a manager or
a hype woman.
Yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah, so Paul is either in a band or has been, he's a musician. He has been in bands. So Ren tries to help him make connections in the city. And that's another thing I guess you could kind of see her character as, being good at, is trying to make these connections. Although she ends up, I guess, making the connections herself and kind of goes off, with the person. But she starts getting close to someone named Eric, who she meets while her and Paul are out. And he is a musician as well. And he's in an up-and-coming band with, as he says, connections in L.A. And we gather that he used to be in a band called the Smithereens. He has a big poster on his wall in his apartment that we see eventually. But they've since broken up, and he's trying to, I guess, get something else going, another band going. And I think it was him that had a line that I really liked. He said, I think it's in the scene where they first meet, or one of the early scenes. He says, "Everyone's a little weird these days. It's normal." Or either he said it or she said. I can't remember. I just wrote that note down because I thought it was very appropriate for this movie. So she stays over Eric's apartment, and she kind of starts getting close with him, or tries to get close with him. She goes back to her apartment, and I thought this was a very fun and funny sequence where she's locked out of her own apartment for missing the rent payments, and she's livid, she's just shouting at the landlord. And even though, it's debatable who's in the right in this situation, but I just found it a very, very comical interaction between them. And so Ren goes to her sister. She goes to see her sister. I gather her sister either lives in maybe Long Island or a little outside the city, maybe. And she goes to her to ask for money and talks with her husband. And and her sister tells her she should move back home, but of course Ren says she's not setting foot in New Jersey ever again, because that's where she's from. And she eventually goes back to Paul, and I like that Paul actually stood up for himself in that scene, because she basically left him high and dry after they met and went on a date together. And but Paul's kind of not having it. He's alone by himself in his van in the middle of his parking lot. I guess it's like an abandoned parking lot. But ultimately he gives in, because I guess she is in some way. A lot of people describe this character, Ren's character, as like annoying, but I actually saw her as more endearing than that. I guess maybe I have a soft spot for the dreamers, But ultimately he gives in. And because he does like her, I think Paul really does like her in this movie. And there's a nice shot of him trying to start his van to kind of get away from her, but Ren's visible in the side mirror of the van, and she's kind of just standing there watching him. And then he eventually stops and goes back. They actually together they hatch a plot to rob her own apartment to get her stuff back, which I thought was another fun little scene.
Going in with masks on.
Yeah, a little petty crime there to kind of foreshadow what happens later, which I also liked. And she stays with Paul for a lot of the movie, or either stays with him or leaves him and comes back to him in his van in the parking lot. Eventually she starts crashing at Eric's place again, and he starts bringing another girl home. And, so there's this kind of back and forth with, okay, who's dating who thinks they're dating who actually doesn't care, I kind of feel like Eric doesn't really care, right? He's like just kind of trying to get his band going and try to make connections. So, yeah.
He'll do whatever he has to do.
Exactly. Which is very punk rock. So, yeah. And I like when she comes back to his apartment, she's like, "Didn't you say come back anytime?" And he's like, "No, no, I didn't say that." So yeah, he kind of just doesn't care, which I think just makes Ren maybe want to hang out with him more, because she probably thinks that's cool and very punk rock of him. She comes back and he says so Ren goes back to Paul again, and he's like, you come back here stinking like an old drunk, so he kind of keeps trying to push her away. And I thought it was one of the more interesting relationship dynamics that I've seen in a film. Like, are they together romantically or as roommates, van mates, or is it more of like a codependent relationship?
They're
like
both kind of just
stubborn,
like using each other. Like, he needs company because he's lonely, and she needs a place to crash, so because of that they find some kind of weird balance. Because
I think ultimately this movie is about lonely people, right? I mean, it's about people that are trying to belong, and
it's about drifters. I mean, they're basically
drifters,
even what's interesting to me about this movie is even the people who have apartments are still living like they're homeless. Like, they're still sleeping on the floor. The place is a mess. The bathtub's filled with bottles of liquor. Like, even the people who have it, with the exception of Ren's friend, whose name is escaping me right this moment. And I'm not seeing it. But Ren has a friend, and
Cecile.
Cecilia. Sorry. So her friend Cecilia, with the exception of her, she seems to kind of have it together in terms of her apartment. But even she says, "I have 4 roommates." And it's like no
Which
one
isn't uncommon in New York, I guess.
No, I've had that many roommates at once for sure. But it's one of those things where like no one's really living like a comfortable standard life in this film. It's all they're all kind of drifters, even if they have a place to sleep every night. No one is really kind of cruising. No one seems to have a normal job. Everyone is kind of all over the place, just figuring out how they're going to get through every single day.
Yeah, how to get through the cracks, I guess.
Yeah.
And Ren has a really good line when she goes back to Paul and they're sitting in the van. She says, "Everyone's trying so hard to be cool, and they're all a bunch of big zeros."
Yeah.
And it's like, because that's like how she sees everyone else, but that's kind of also, I think, secretly how she sees herself, or doesn't want to see herself, but it's kind of what she's doing. So just to go back to, like I said, there's not much of a plot in this film. It's more of a character study, but just to kind of give the rest of what basically happens. So surprise, Eric's LA plans fall through, and he proposes a dangerous idea to Ren to get some money. So they end up, they rob a man in a bar. So I guess Ren meets him, and it's kind of like what's the term for that? Where it's like you're like you find like a mark, like someone who seems like you can kind of get over on them.
Yeah.
So they, she kind of flirts with this older guy, and they get in a cab together, and then Paul or I'm sorry, and then Eric gets in the other side of the cab and takes a gun out, and points it at the guy, and basically they rob him, and this is all to keep their LA dreams alive, I guess. So all the while, like, what I was thinking is that it seems like she actually has a lot more in common with the lovable loser Paul, because I feel like Eric is more of like, he's a bad boy, but his morals are very questionable, I think. And she kind of like leads Ren down this path. You saw it a little bit in the scene with Paul where they go back to get her stuff from her apartment, where they put the masks on, and it's kind of like they're robbing her own apartment. But I mean, it is her apartment, so it's not like actually that bad, But I saw that as a kind of like a lead up to this scene. So this is obviously a lot more serious. And eventually Eric just takes some money and runs. So, we assume that he's gone to LA. I think his girlfriend / roommate tells Ren that when she comes to
I think that was actually his wife. I think she said that they got married
at
some point.
Yeah. Was it wife or ex-wife? I forget.
I think wife. I think she said we got married a month ago.
Right. So, I forgot that. So he actually has a wife. Yeah. So, I mean, Eric is not the most forthcoming individual. It kind of seems like he's out for himself to just to get big. So but anyway, he takes the money and runs, I guess, from his wife too. And then she goes back to the club that we saw from the beginning, the Peppermint Lounge, which is actually like a real club that was around back in the day. And she gets kicked out of the club, and she's kind of throwing a fit there and literally thrown out in the street. And she goes back to Paul, who's still in the van in the parking lot, and only Paul's not there. It's just the man who actually bought his van from him, who we saw earlier in the movie, asking him about his van. So Paul actually isn't there at the end, and but at least she gets her portable TV back, right?
Yeah.
She does get that. She carries that black and white TV around with her the whole movie. But that's the ending, basically, is her kind of just walking away again and going off on her own. And like you said, Jeremy, she's a drifter.
She's a drifter. It makes sense. As they come. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much the end of the movie there. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. This is it's such an interesting film. Because it feels just so kind of unlike so many of the films you see about dreamers, about people who are chasing something. It's
very youth oriented. It's like the aimless youth, I felt.
Yeah, and I think that word aimless is a perfect way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
It almost seems like none of these people really know what they want. It just kind of seems like they're young and they feel like they should, like, we understand she wants to kind of be part of the scene, but like we even said before, like, we don't really exactly understand what she wants to do with it. It's kind of like a dog, like chasing a garbage truck. It's like she just wants to get it because she feels like she should. There's not really any. It doesn't seem like there's a point to it. It doesn't seem like she's not a musician who is practicing her music. She doesn't really seem to have any business skills. She just kind of wants to be part of this world. Just in the way I kind of get the feeling like Paul, when he's stopping by the city, it doesn't really seem like he knows why he's stopping by New York City. It kind of just seems like he just wanted to kind of experience it. And there's this kind of interesting thing, which I just thought of now with you kind of recapping the plot here, Mark, is this idea of hierarchy. And this idea that it's kind of like there's a chain of command where, it seems like Eric is kind of above Ren, she's kind of having to chase after him. And then it seems like Ren is kind of above Paul a little bit.
Paul's
and he's
kind
of chasing her. But what's interesting, what I like about this so much, is just because someone is kind of lower down in the totem pole doesn't mean that they don't get agency. It doesn't mean that they don't get to argue and stand up for themselves. All these characters are fighting for themselves.
Well, that's what I liked about Paul. Yeah, like I said, he does stand up for himself, even though he ultimately usually ends up taking Ren back because he is lonely. They're both lonely. But even at the end of the film, he's not there anymore. Like, he's left.
So he makes himself heard.
He's done with her, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting in this film, because as you mentioned earlier, there are some people, kind of people who are critical of this film and who aren't as fond of it. We'll talk about Ren as annoying.
Yeah,
which is
really
really
described as like abrasive and all kinds of, which I understand, but
I understand where they're coming from. But I don't know. At least personally, I think a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that we're following a young woman rather than a young man.
Yeah,
I think because you see plenty of these young men in cinema who are kind of jackasses and taking advantage. I mean, I don't think
You don't
like
see that too much with
with young women, and
women
I think if her character was a man, people would say, oh, he's a shady dealer, he's tough,
Yeah.
he's
He's
great.
just a shyster. Yeah.
He's just, but because it's a young
Right.
woman, I think people are kind of like, oh, she's annoying. But like, I think
Yeah.
there's something kind of really radically exciting, particularly about a movie from 1982 that
Yeah.
shows like a young woman fighting, but not in a glamorous way. Like she's not
Yeah.
like the sweet girl who wants something. Like she's
It
someone
actually-
who's a little weathered.
It felt like very modern, actually.
Yeah.
To because now you see it a little bit more frequently. I feel like there's more diversity now, and but at the time, 1982, and a woman filmmaker as well.
Yeah.
I thought that she was very interesting, and definitely not a character that you see a lot in movies, especially around that time. Which, I think that's why I was so fascinated by her and interested in what she was going to do next. And I did want to talk about the acting because I felt like the actor choices were interesting, and I think they made sense because I think actually all the stars of the movie, apart from Richard Hell, were all newcomers to the screen. Richard Hell obviously is I guess maybe not obviously. I actually wasn't too familiar with him, but he was a very big punk figure influencing, you said even Sex Pistols, right, Jeremy?
Yeah, from what I understand, he was one of the first people. Sonically, he was a big deal, but I think the bigger thing with him even is aesthetically. He was one of the first people to wear the spiky hair and the ripped clothes. When you think of
when you think of punk rock,
a 70s punk rocker,
Right.
that guy you think of is Richard Hell. Like he's the one who
he's credited with starting that trend.
Yeah.
So he kind of had the whole style down, and he was in a lot of bands. I would say notably Television, a band called Neon Boys, the Heartbreakers, and he also was. He had a band after his own name, Richard Hell and the Voidoids, and they had an album, Blank Generation, which was very influential. It came out in 1977, a very influential punk album, and so he was legit. I mean, he was the real deal. And so I guess you could say at this time in the early 80s, maybe he wasn't as, maybe he wasn't as prolific, but I think it's interesting to have a figure like that in this movie and playing that role. It just brings that extra authenticity to it.
Yeah.
And I think everyone in the movie does feel very authentic, and I think sometimes maybe the acting didn't work as well as maybe everyone wanted it to, as a filmmaker wanted it to. But I think that's just part of it being a very raw, kind of visceral film. I think they were just trying to get a certain energy down, and just doing what they could and filming what they knew, the streets that they knew and the people that they were associated with. So
well, and also probably not as many takes as you would get on a normal
that's
film.
also true.
We're talking about a very low budget film where realistically they might have only had a location long enough to do one take, and if you didn't get the exact perfect performance you wanted, that's life, and you just have to live with it.
Yeah, I think a lot of times you do see the limitations in the acting, but like I said, a lot of these actors, this was their first role ever. Maybe they had appeared in maybe off-Broadway play or something like that, but this was their first film for a lot of these people. So, I thought everyone did a good job, and I think conveyed what Susan Seidelman was looking for. And actually, the one actor who played Paul. He was in a movie with Zoe Lund when I was looking up his credits.
Oh, really? That's so funny.
Oddly enough, from Miss 45, Special Effects from 1985, which I found interesting because that just has a direct connection to another movie we talked about in the series. I thought so. The acting was interesting in the movie, and I did like the main actress. Susan Berman is her name, who played Ren. I thought it was a very interesting portrayal of a wannabe who's always chasing after the next big thing, wanting to be part of the scene without actually really doing anything. And I found her endearing and appealing in that sense, and kind of sad actually. I found her to be a very sad character, but she has moments of just being funny and kind of seeing things as a joke, which is very punk rock, I would say. But I think all around it was a good portrayal of youth in general. That longing, the wanting to be a part of something or to belong. I mean, that definitely is what comes across here.
Yeah. And I think something that's funny too is that this character, what she really wants is to be part of the punk scene and live the punk life. But there's kind of nothing more punk than the life she's already living. You know what I mean? Like that. The
That's
idea
true,
of punk rock is like, oh, you have to be gritty. And I think there is this thing. I'm a pretty big rock and roll fan, and I think Mark, you are as well,
Yeah.
just based on some other stuff we talked about in the past. There is this idea in rock and roll where it's like you're supposed to kind of come from nothing and you have to live in the streets for a while, and and I think a lot of the bands that we know and love who kind of have that narrative might not have kind of done it as much as we thought. Like it's like the thing where you find out that someone, oh, they were so street, but realistically their, dad is the executive at the record
Trust
company.
Fund baby or
Something like that, which there's nothing wrong. Like, believe me, I know people, and I know of people who come from lineage in the film industry and the music industry and are successful, who are wonderfully talented and deserve everything they get. Nothing wrong.
Doesn't mean you can't be authentic.
Doesn't mean, but it's one of those things when you see a lot of people kind of claiming to have come from nothing when they didn't. So it's interesting in this, seeing someone who really kind of has nothing, like she's really living the punk rock lifestyle because it's like she has no prospects. She's just a punk,
It's almost like there's nothing more punk than just kind of wandering aimlessly, you know,
like
really being part of anything.
Yeah, like she's not punk. She is a punk. Like she is a punk. She is just a street dwelling miscreant who just causes trouble for people, which is kind of really radically fun to watch.
It's a unique character, and I thought I actually thought the most interesting thing about Ren as a main character is that she's one of those characters that you don't know if she's lying or if she really believes what she says. Yeah. Or a little bit of both. It's almost like it's almost like you can never really take what she says at face value. Yeah. Which is interesting.
Or if she even knows.
Or if she even knows. Yeah.
It seems like sometimes she's saying things kind of believing that it'll be true, but deep down knowing it's not. She
might feel like she's being genuine or think she's being genuine, but she really isn't. Yeah. So I thought that was interesting to see in a main character in a movie for sure. We talked about the acting a little bit. I did want to mention, obviously, so I actually realized when I was watching this movie, Jeremy, that we talked about a lot of the first films from a filmmaker in the series, or we will be talking about a lot coming up. We talked about Miss 45. We're going to talk about Spike Lee's first film. So, and I think that makes sense, right? Because first film from directors. So we're talking about independent films here, and obviously, like these people went on to be these iconic directors, a lot of them, but they had to start somewhere, and I think you really see that here with Susan Seidelman. It made me want to watch Desperately Seeking Susan, which she did after this. I've heard good things about that movie.
Yeah,
so I definitely want to continue my journey with her, because
it's definitely a lot more polished. It's definitely
it has Madonna in it, so
it's definitely a lot more of like, I don't want to say like a Hollywood film, but it kind of feels more like an 80s movie in a weird way. Like, to me, what I love about this movie is it feels totally like an 80s movie, but it's so specific that it kind of transcends that. Yeah. It's just so like such like a dart thrown at a specific point in time and a specific scene in time that it almost doesn't feel like an 80s movie. It kind of just feels like this artifact that is just exists separately on its own of that thing.
Yeah. Well, obviously she would go on to do more Hollywood projects, but I think this is like her first film, I guess. Maybe she had done some student films, but this was like her first actual film.
Feature,
it's a great first effort, and I think just has that raw energy, not only because it's a first time filmmaker, but just the scene that they were documenting at the time is very raw, and I thought it was very exciting world to be in, and the camera work I thought was at times very it fit what they were trying to portray. Like I said, the scene early on when they're in the club, like it's kind of the camera's kind of like moving along with her, and I thought it was very dynamic. So it's definitely a great film for budding filmmakers to check out. I think it's like one of those inspiring first films to check out. And very interesting as well that this film, I've seen different reports. So I've seen reported that it was one of the first American independent films to be selected to show in the main competition at the Cannes Film Festival. But I've also seen that it is the very first American film or American independent film to screen, to show at the Cannes Film Festival. So whichever one of those is true, it's very impressive.
Especially for how much of an indie film this is. We're not talking about like indie, but like with a good amount of money to support it. Like we're talking about it like an indie with a capital I, shooting it with your friends kind of film.
Right. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
And so I'm definitely glad that we included it in this series. But yeah, I didn't have too much else to say about this movie. I just really enjoyed it, my first time watching it. And, I think it was like one of those movies, similar to Liquid Sky or other movies we watched where it's super low budget and you can tell it's just like friends and family, they're helping out with the crew and acting and showing up in the movie. And there's also, I think there's some other like punk, people of the punk scene at that time that kind of show up in the movie in different roles. And actually, you know what? The last thing I wanted to talk about, Jeremy, is the music, because the movie is very much about music. How did you feel about how the music was presented in this movie?
I really enjoyed the music with this. I mean, it's subtle. I think for a movie that's kind of about the punk scene, I think it would have been easy to, especially for an independent film, to just fill the movie up with just scenes of like bands playing music, which could be cool in its own right. But I feel like it could have been a little bit of a distraction because that's not really what it's about. Yeah. I like that it was kind of just like a subtle little touch how
it's almost like background music. And
just this theme would be worked in. What I will say is that the very opening shot of the film, it's a shot of a woman holding a pair of sunglasses, these kind of checkerboard sunglasses that remind me of a pair of Vans skate shoes. She's holding these sunglasses and it's slow motion, and you just have like this kind of like big guitar like build up, and then Ren steals the sunglasses and runs away. Just for me, that moment, and I think that moment was honestly the first time I watched this movie that stuck with me more than anything else that I just loved. It's just like you're just so thrown into the film, and it's just like it's one of those things where when you get one of those moments in a movie where the image, the lighting and the music, it just all work, and the writing, just everything just works together. I think that moment in this movie, that opening shot is one of those rare moments when everything just comes together just so perfectly, and you're just thrown into a world and just totally get exactly the feeling of the film from the first few seconds of the picture.
Yeah. I feel like there's actually a couple of iconic shots in the movie, like, though, you mentioned the wardrobe in Miss 45. I think the wardrobe in this movie was really good.
Yeah,
and terrific. I think probably very authentic. I mean, there's probably a lot of the clothes that maybe the crew or cast were actually wearing, or owned. Or they probably just got them from thrift stores. But the scene, I think it's towards the end of the movie, actually, where Ren is sitting on the subway train and she's dressed in like this very extravagant getup. It's just like very flashy, but also very punk rock at the same time. It's like short skirt, the red lace up shoes, and she's got this like pink, I don't know if it's like Angora or what it is, top on, and it's just like all those colors going on with her laying on the subway seat is just really good, and one of those, like, for me, iconic images of like indie film. And to just touch on the music really quickly, I agree with you, Jeremy, because I'm kind of in the middle, because part of me expected more, I guess, from the music aspect of the film, because the movie is about punk rockers, and I thought, maybe it'd be like a cool soundtrack, whatever. And I do like the soundtrack, but I agree with you, though, that you said, you mentioned that you could go too far in that direction. You could lean too heavily on the music. And I think it's refreshing that the movie did not do that, and that it kind of just let it be a little bit of like a, background character or side character in the film, as opposed to the main character, right? So there really wasn't, I don't think there's hardly any scenes besides maybe a couple of quick scenes at the club where you actually see anyone playing music or any bands like performing or anything like that.
It's not what it's about.
It's not what it's about. Yeah. So in a way, it's actually pretty refreshing, and because they were focused on a different aspect of what, what was happening in the scene. So I actually thought that was kind of cool. And the more I think about it, I think I do like that approach to the music. And also I wonder, maybe how much of that was they couldn't get the rights to music, or, I wonder if maybe they had people in, like, friends and bands that maybe could have provided music.
Although you would think with Richard Hell in the movie, they could get some punk music.
Exactly, yeah. So maybe that was maybe it was more of an artistic choice.
Kind of an artistic,
Yeah, maybe they just decided they didn't want to do that. So, yeah, good on them. I think it worked out well. But yeah, I think it's a very unique film, and definitely one to check out if you're interested in cult films or indie films or both. Jeremy, did you have any last thoughts or any like moments or scenes that really stuck out to you?
I think that opening scene was the big one for me that I just wanted to make sure we hit on that. I will say, just with this movie, if you enjoyed this one, a couple other recommendations that I would have are First off, just another female filmmaker, which is exciting, is The Decline of Western Civilization, Part 1,
I've been wanting
Penelope
to watch
Spheris.
that.
Really, really terrific. Kind of, as far as I'm concerned, the definitive documentary on punk music. So
She did it throughout different decades, correct?
It's mostly 70s.
Okay.
The Decline of Western Civilization came out in 1981. So it's mostly 70s into early 80s. But so she did that. That was part 1. Then she had Decline of Western Civilization Part 2. It's called The Metal Years, which is about kind of Los Angeles metal, which I'm a big fan of hair metal. I really enjoy that one. And then I believe Part 3. I don't think I've actually seen Part 3, but I believe Part 3 kind of gets more into like 90s punk.
Okay.
But it is interesting seeing these 3 movies kind of track that. So that's one recommendation. Decline of Western.
Penelope Spheris, right? That's
Penelope Spheris,
Yeah,
who also
who did
directed
Wayne's World.
Wayne's World. Yeah.
Yeah, which is one of my favorite comedies of all time.
Yeah, so someone who really understands rock and roll. And then another recommendation, if you like this one, just this kind of gritty New York City ragtag filmmaking style, is the film Heaven Knows What. It's not their first film, but one of the Safdie brothers' first films. The Safdie brothers, who of course did Uncut Gems recently and Good Time. Heaven Knows What. It's a pretty heavy movie. It's about heroin addiction. But just in terms of gritty New York City filmmaking, I think it's a terrific contemporary example that clearly owes some debts to filmmakers like Susan Seidelman and films like Smithereens. So just those are a couple movies that, if you like this one, I think might be worth kind of checking out.
Great. Awesome. And next time on the show, we're going to go to 1983 with Valley Girl, directed by Martha Coolidge. And that has Nicolas Cage in it. And I'm always down for some Nicolas Cage. So very excited. I've not seen that film either. So watch along with us and check it out. And we'll talk about it in part 4 of our series, 80s Indies. Thank you very much for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.